Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Mavrogiannis. I'm a postdoc at the University of Washington. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. We have Sanjeev Kopal, who is an associate professor at the University of Florida in electrical and computer engineering. Sanjeev is the director of the Focus Lab. Prior to joining the University of Florida, he was a researcher at the Texas Instruments Imaging R&D Lab. Before that, he was a postdoc at Harvard. And before that, he received his PhD and master's degrees from the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Before that, he was at USC, where he got his bachelor's. He has received several awards, including Best Paper Awards for ECCV and the NEMS conference, as well as he has been a Best Paper finalist for conferences like CVPR. Besides that, he has received awards like the NSF Career Award, and he's also a senior IEEE member. His interests span computer vision, computational photography, and optics, as well as novel cameras and sensors, 3D reconstruction, physics-based vision, and active illumination. Today, he will talk to us about adaptive attention. And other than that, I'm super excited to have Sanjeev start. Sanjeev, whenever you're ready, feel free to start.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everyone at UW for giving me this opportunity. And I know it's always, even though we've had a lot of experience, very hard to do this kind of virtual talks. So please send a message so Chris can read it if there's some trouble with my audio. I know there's a little fan in the background. We couldn't stop that or any other thing with videos or anything. So I'm Sanjeev, and today I'm going to talk to you about adaptive attention. So to jump into it, first I'm going to show you a sensor which has no adaptive attention, right? So this is a scene, a street scene, and a scan by a sensor called a Velodyne LiDAR. So it's a depth sensor, tells how far away things are, and it's a very commonly used LiDAR in autonomous cars. And this sensor is equiangular, so it samples the same number of angles every time, irrespective of what's in the scene. And you might imagine that the sensor is spending too much time on the road. Maybe it should spend its time on distant cars and pedestrians and other objects of interest. So one of my students built a LiDAR in our lab, and here it is scanning a very simple scene. So this is a 3D printed flower and bottle. And now this is the LiDAR scanning equiangular. Can everyone see the video okay? Chris, you can give me a thumbs up. It's okay, all right. But what this sensor can do that's different from the Velodyne is that it can change where it samples. It's adaptive. So it can put all its samples on one object or the other. And so when it does this, it's increasing the angular resolution. So it's doing a kind of LiDAR zoom onto either object. And we showed in an RSS paper a few years back and some follow-up work that it can do much better than this. It can do smart zoom. So you can zoom onto an object of interest, but still keep track of nearby objects of interest. So that's an adaptive sensor. And this idea of adaptive sensing, it comes from active vision, right? And active vision, we're inspired by active vision in biological systems, right? So each of us in our eye, we have a fovea, a region of high acuity that we move around with eye movements, right? And that concentrates our attention. Many other animals, for example, eagles or hawks, they have two fovea. They have multiple fovea in their eyes, and they use this to capture prey. And even other animals like bats that use sonar, they use echolocation, they move their ears to help with targeting prey. So in all these different examples, active vision involves fast mechanical movements, right? Changing your attention, your point of view. And that happens jointly with computer vision tasks. There's no real daylight between the bat's moving its ears and its vision task of tracking and capturing a prey, right? They're together. So everyone has been inspired by this active vision from biological sensors. And in fact, active vision is an old field, right? There's a lot of previous work in active vision. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just briefly talk about the previous work in using these two axes. One axis is the speed of modulation, how fast the camera changes. And the other, the y-axis, is how much AI or intelligence has been integrated. So for example, one of your really simple cell phone cameras is a pinhole camera. So it captures equiangularly one image or a video, and all the AI processing happens afterwards in the cloud or after capture, right? So that's one example. In my field, which is computational photography, light fields, and compressive sensing, there's been a lot of work on this kind of active vision for reconfigurable cameras that capture the light field efficiently. But most of the work in active vision has been done by applied perception, robotics, and active vision, right? So if you have a swarm of robots, if you want more samples on something, you move the robot closer to the object, right? That's how you do so. And there's also been some work on neuromorphic sensors where you actually have photo sensors of different sizes on the back. So all of this active vision work is good, but it's really far away from where we want to be. It's really far away from how biological systems use active vision and how integrated it is with AI. But that's what I want to do. I'm very interested in fast adaptive attention, building cameras that are able to do it in hardware, but also have algorithms that control it properly. Now, if we had this fast adaptive attention, we could open up new applications in vision and robotics. For example, if you have an array of heterogeneous cameras, you could adaptively sample them in interesting ways to detect anomalies, which are very important in a battlefield like mines or where the enemy is at. If you build cameras that are modeled off of biological efficiency, you have a chance of building cameras that have efficient SWaP-C. Maybe one day they can fly on insect robots. You can open up new kinds of applications. Imagine you can control a swarm of UAVs with your eye movements because they can zoom into your eyes. And additionally, we can open up the camera, every part of the camera, to higher level algorithms like SLAM to do their task more efficiently. So there's a lot of advantages of doing fast adaptive active vision. And today I'm going to show you 3 projects that we've been working on. I'm going to show you an adaptive LiDAR, an adaptive camera, and an adaptive projector. The LiDAR and the projector are sort of low to medium level control, right? Simple kinds of closed loop or open loop control. The camera is high level end-to-end learning based control, right? So there'll be a little bit for everyone. So let's jump into the first sensor, which is a LiDAR. So we're going to start with a preliminary LiDAR design from a few years ago, and I'll slowly build it up to what we have working nowadays. So this is the block diagram of our LiDAR design. We have a computer that controls a small piece of optics, and this is a single micro mirror. This is a 3.6 millimeter aluminum coated mirror, right? I buy these from a startup in California called Miracle, and you can control these. There are 2 voltages, one for the x-axis, one for the y-axis. It's azimuth and elevation, theta feet. And these can point in any different direction within their field of view, which is a plus minus 15 degrees. I reflect off of this mirror a laser from a LiDAR engine. It's a Lightware engine that I bought. Now, usually this LiDAR single ray gives you 1 depth point, but if you reflect it off the mirror and move it around, you can get a point cloud, right? So this is the block diagram of how we've built our LiDAR. And this is a common block diagram for a MEMS modulated LiDAR. That's what this is, MEMS mirror modulated LiDAR. And many people have built similar devices, but they usually run the MEMS in resonance. That means the same angles every time, agnostic towards in the same. What we've done is we've tried to control the mirror to be a little bit more intelligent. And we're the only one in this space, other than some people at CMU who have been working on a similar problem with structured light, which is very different from LiDAR. This is work by David Held and Srinivasa Narasimhan out at CMU. Okay, so now we have this LiDAR, but the question is, how do we control it? Right? Like, how do we decide where to move the mirror? And so the way we do it is we borrow an algorithm from robotics. So here's an algorithm. This is an algorithm from Ben Charo in RSS many years back. And the way this algorithm works is that it's a closed form solution, saying that if you have a previous scan of the scene, let's say you have a 3D scan of the scene, and you shoot one LiDAR ray into the scene. What's the information gained from that shooting? You can see this equation, which is derived in detail in Charo et al., has the number of cells in your occupancy map, which is a proxy for the point cloud. Each cell has some statistics like mean and standard deviation. And if you've calibrated your LiDAR, then you can calibrate it as a Gaussian beam. You can have the probability of getting that depth map interact with the probability of there being something in that direction and get a closed form solution. Now we use this equation in an algorithm I'll talk in the next slide, but I just want to pause here for a moment. Ben Charo doesn't care about MEMS modulated LiDARs, right? He cares about robots. And that algorithm is for robots with fixed LiDARs. And if the robot wants to know something about some area, these robots move physically closer to there, getting more samples, right? But here, we're using that algorithm for the mirror. Here, the mirror is the robot. Right? And so I'll go into a little bit more detail about the algorithm. Suppose you have a previous scan of the scene over here. You break the world into boxes. This is the occupancy map. And you have a cost for each box. Now, if the cost is just something like the probability distribution of something being there or the geometric complexity, then that simplifies into Ben Charo's algorithm. But you could put anything in there. You could put whether or not there's a depth edge, whether there's color or anything like this into the box. And then you generate candidate trajectories. This is simulation in the sensor before it captures, right? It's pretending to capture before it actually captures, and it generates trajectories. So here's one candidate trajectory. Suppose I move the MEMS mirror like this, what's my information gain, right? And it picks the best trajectory using Charo's metric. And now you wouldn't be surprised by the way this algorithm is set up with a local step and a global step. This is the way that many robot planning algorithms are done. These are the way many active vision algorithms are done, but the robot is the camera, right? So now I'm going to show you some applications of this very initial LiDAR that we built some years back. The first application you've already seen, which is Smart Zoom. Here's an equiangular scan of that simple scene. Here's zoom into either object. It's a naive zoom. You totally commit to zooming onto this object and you lose everything else. But here is Smart Zoom based on the algorithm that I just talked about, where the boxes on the object of interest are increased in value, right? But the still other boxes have value. And so you optimize the path among the physically realizable MEMS trajectories to get the best information. Here's another application. Now, suppose from another sensor or from a low-res sensor, you could get depth edges. What could you do? So here's an example of a scene. It's two planes at some distance away from you. And here's an equiangular scan of that. But what you can do instead is you can reason about where the depth edges are and only scan there. And so if you stick to the depth edges, that saves you time. But if you spend more time on the depth edges, you can average those and get a better measurement. Either way, you can use both of this with gradient-based reconstruction to reconstruct the whole scene. Now, gradient-based reconstruction, obtaining the signal from its derivatives, is well understood in imaging, vision, graphics, and many other fields.
There is maybe a quick question by Sawyer. So it says, is the bottle zoomed in less?
So there's some other entity, let's say user, some other entity says that the flower is important. I want to zoom onto the flower. Now in the naive zoom, what would happen earlier is all the samples would go on the flower. You'd lose everything. But in the smart zoom, you take the input that yes, the flower is important, but you still keep track of the other things and you optimize to get a solution where you have increased samples on the flower as was demanded by some higher level algorithm or by a user, but you still keep track of nearby objects. So hopefully that answers it. All right. So let's jump into the next application. This is the last one for this particular version of my LiDAR. And so this is still in progress. And so to give you an idea of how it would work, I'm going to show you this very simple YouTube. Please let me know, Chris, with a thumbs up if this is playing. And so this is a hawk that's being moved around, but the hawk is stabilizing. The stabilizing is happening in hardware, right? And so I took a few frames from this and I averaged it. And you get this kind of image where the hawk's body, the face is static, but the rest of the scene is blurred. So we're doing a similar kind of thing. This is joint work with Karthik Dantu out at University of Buffalo. So we built our sensor and we sent it over to him. And so he put it on one of his drones. And so hopefully you can see this. Let me know if it's not playing, but here's our sensor. It's on his drone now. And what we did is we also added a vector nav IMU. It's a very high-end IMU that gives you compensated measurements. And we use that to control the MEMS mirror to do this kind of compensation in hardware for LiDAR. So now you can see there are two lasers on this drone. One is just a laser pointer attached. That's this one here. Can you all see my cursor? Can you see my cursor okay? All right, so this is the laser pointer. And so when it moves, you can see the pointer shaking. And here's the visible light through the MEMS. And when it's uncompensated, you can see both of them kind of move the same way. So here's uncompensated in a second. Let me move it up. You can see just shaking, right? It's flying. Both the laser pointer and the MEMS modulated dart are not affected at all. They're just having a lot of motion issues. But then what you can do after that is you can compensate for this. Let me just jump ahead. Now it's compensated, and you can see when the object is moving, the laser pointer is moving, but the MEMS mirror is compensating for the dart. Can you see this? The dart is in the same place, but the laser pointer is moving. Right. So this is in hardware motion stabilization. We're kind of decoupling some of the rotation from the LiDAR measurements. We think that can help with SLAP. So this is ongoing work. Just to give you a sense, the robot moves from left to right in this top row. It moves from up to down in this bottom row. And the x-axis is how much sampling frequency we have with the IMU. Of course, the higher sampling frequency you get, the better control. And both of these dots approach the radius of the dot when nothing is moving, which is the ideal, right? So they're getting much closer to it. Okay, so this was the LiDAR that we built a few years ago. And we had an improved version in 3DV a couple of years ago. And we improved it in a few ways. The first way we improved it is by adding a camera, right? So now we don't just have this LiDAR where we can control, where we can sample. We also have a calibrated, co-centered color image of the scene. So that's one thing that we did. We put the camera on our LiDAR and we built this device. It's on a trolley. It can move around on a cart. It can move around. It's 3-meter range, plus minus 2 centimeter error. That's not very awesome, but the cool thing about this LiDAR is that it can do 50 points at 30 frames per second, 50 points in the field of view. It can put them wherever you like, right? You can put them, you can zoom, you can distribute them equally, whatever you like. We also have a Kinect. So for indoor scenes, we have something else to compare. I'm not saying whether we're better or worse than Kinect. It's just for viewing. The last improvement that we did with our LiDAR is an optical trick. Maybe you don't care, but I thought I would go over it here. If you remember, the LiDAR engine is a single ray that reflects off the MEMS mirror, right? And so that single ray gets concentrated by a lens into a single pixel to decide whether there's a depth measurement or not. Now, when that lens is in focus, we have this weird problem that when the dot moves at extreme ends of the field of view, it not only moves on the image plane, it's not measured at all. So you have this weird effect that when you change the field of view, there's a place when you're in focus where your field of view is degenerate. And so what we did instead is a very neat trick. We put the measuring device within the focal length of the lens. Now, many of you have used a magnifying glass, right? How do you use a magnifying glass? You bring it close to the text. Within the focal length of the text, you get a virtual image, a magnified image, if you remember from high school physics. This is what we're doing. Our dot that's received is always blurred, but it's blurred in the same way, and we have consistent field of view over the range. Maybe you don't care, but it's an interesting optical trick I thought I would tell you about. Now I'll show you raw output of our sensor. Here's a color image of a scene in the lab. Here's a Kinect image of that scene. And here's our sensor. Remember, we have a color image and 50 points where we can put them wherever we like. And you can see these 50 depth points are very similar to the Kinect in color. So we're getting decent depth. Here's another example. Here's some hands. And again, we get 50 points. You can see the light blue, the teal hands correspond to the teal image, the green hands correspond to the green image, and we also get this color image, right? So we're able to get this kind of data. This is with no machine learning. This is just the raw output of our sensor. So what we can do with this, and I'm sure many of you may have already got to this if you work in this area for a while, is we can add machine learning to fill in the gaps of the depth map. So this is called guided upsampling. And there's many ways you can do this. Here's one way. You can take a data set which has color and depth images. So here's the NYU data set. There are countless such data sets. And you can build images as if they were captured by our sensor, as if they have a color image with a few depth points in different places. And you can train an off-the-shelf network. I mean, we used a UNet, but you can use whatever you like to fill in the depth map and get the full depth. So this is called guided upsampling. There are 100 papers in guided upsampling every year at CVPR. At this stage, it's a fairly mature subfield, right? You're using a full signal to fill in the gaps of another signal. It's related to super resolution and many other areas. So we did it as well. We have our own guided upsampling. So here's the color image in the top row. Here's the Kinect to look at. The third is our measurement. And the fourth is we have filled in the depth using the color as a guide, right? We have good results on NYU and we have good results on our real data set that we built in our lab. But this is fine. This is just like another 100 papers. But what we can do with our sensor is different. What we can do with our sensor is that we can put our samples onto some region of interest, right? It's not just uniform samples. So we can, have uniform sampling. We can zoom onto one object. We can have sparse sampling. We can have sparse sampling in one dimension and dense sampling in another dimension. We can do whatever we like, and we can upscale the depth when we do this, right? So this was the first time that anyone showed foveated guided upsampling, right? And we got a result that maybe is not earth-shattering, but it's good to know. And the result is that if you have a foveated LiDAR and it puts more samples in some area of interest, you reconstruct better in that area, right? And so we tested this in simulation and we tested this on real data as well, right? It's nice to know that it's useful to put the samples in some region of interest, right? And now I'm going to show you some video results. I only have 3. But you understand the real results are in the table, right, across the entire data set. So here's one example in the lab. Here's me pouring milk, and you can see these points here that are tracking the motion. It's a very simple control algorithm here, extremely simple, just doing background subtraction, and where things move, we put the samples there, right? Now remember, these samples here, they don't happen in software. Happening in real time in hardware. The MEMS is moving to the motion place and putting samples there, right? It's not happening in software. And we know the place it puts more samples is reconstructed better from the table, right, on average. Here's another example, again, very simple example where the control algorithm is just motion background subtraction, right? Just motion tracking. But the samples are changing in real time with the LiDAR moving into the place of interest. Here's another example where the control is not background subtraction, but instead is color. And it's, there's nothing red in the background, and we're sort of putting all our samples on this red flower in real time, right? So we can control these 50 depth points at 30 frames per second. And this is an open loop control. All right, so that was our LiDAR. I can pause here for a second. I just want to say that I showed you a LiDAR with low level control, right? Next, we're going to do end-to-end deep learning control of a camera. But there was color control, background subtraction, and I showed you different kinds of LiDAR examples. So the next part of the talk is about an adaptive camera, right? And to start, I'm going to show you the block diagram of our LiDAR. You remember our LiDAR had a single LiDAR reflected off a MEMS mirror, and it moved on the scene. But now I'm replacing this LiDAR with a camera. And so this is a passive sensor. So instead of sending out a laser into the scene, I'm receiving sort of a region that the mirror is looking at, right? And this is inspired by our eyes. Our eyes basically have a region of fovea that moves over the scene. And there's also a low-res kind of surround sound that we get from our eyes. And that's called foveated imaging. We built a first foveated camera using a MEMS mirror in ICCP. That's the big computational photography conference a few years ago. Here you can see it's tracking a cricket ball that my student is holding, right? And this is fine, but you can buy a camera from Amazon that does this in software, right? But what's cool about our camera is that the MEMS mirror is extremely fast, right? So here my student is holding two different objects and the MEMS mirror is moving from one to the other. And in the paper, we have a Kalman filter algorithm that tracks where these two objects are and moves the mirror in real time to look at these two, right? So here's the raw data from the single camera. And if you interleave it, if you extract the interleaved data, you get the impression that there are two virtual cameras dedicated to each target, right? At high resolution, much higher resolution than the helper camera. So I just want you to note that this is a little different from Ishikawa lab out in Japan. They have some amazing stuff with Galvo mirrors with only one target, not multiple targets like us, but I encourage you to go look at their webpage. You can easily lose an afternoon looking at Ishikawa lab results. But this is working with multiple objects that we are tracking. Okay. So now that we have built this camera, then we are coming up now with an algorithm to decide where to pay attention, right? And so where to pay attention at this high resolution depends on what task you have. And so the task we're looking at is monocular depth reconstruction. So this is work that we're very excited about. It was in ICCV last year. So this application, monocular depth sensing, unsupervised monocular depth sensing, is kind of exciting. A few years ago, some papers have come up with it. Now it's exploded. I'm sure many of you have already worked on this already. And the idea is the following. I don't want to use a data set. I want to be able to go from a color image to a depth map. You can imagine this is a situation for a robot on the moon or on Europa or some other place where there's no data set. How will it do it, right? That's the idea. And so I'm going to briefly explain unsupervised monocular depth sensing, right? If you already know it, I apologize just in case you do not, right? So strangely, unsupervised monocular depth sensing starts with the stereo camera. Now at test time, there's only one camera, but during training, there's two cameras, stereo, right? There's left and the right. And you learn that the network takes only one image, tries to obtain the depth. It uses that depth to warp the left image to the right image. And if the depth is perfect, these should match very much so, other than occlusions. And it computes a loss, a sum of squared differences, which is called photometric loss in this area. And you reduce the photometric loss, then you get the depth. That's during training, and during testing, you don't need the right camera, right? Your left camera is getting depth, okay? So from now on, when I show you anything, you remember that during training, there's two cameras, right? But I'm only going to show you one. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to define a new kind of camera called a saccade camera. And the saccade cam distributes resolution intelligently. So here's again a low-res version of a scene from the Kitty dataset. We want to compute this thing, which is an attention map, where we should pay attention. In those areas, we want to increase the resolution. And so now we have a hybrid image here, where some places are high res. Look at this pedestrian or this cyclist, much high res. Some areas are still low res, right? And we want to use that for unsupervised monocular depth reconstruction. Remember, there are going to be two of these saccade cams during training. And so we want to use this to get depth. And we think we can do well, especially when resolution is at a peak, when you don't have much resolution compared to what's in this. So we did this. Here's our setup. I have no proof that this theoretical proof that this algorithm works. It's trial and error that we got this to work. So I'll start with the first component is over here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. This is the same part that I showed you, unsupervised monocular depth reconstruction, but the camera is a saccade cam. It's a camera with hybrid high res and low res. We use this for reconstructing the depth, right? And we train a network to do this. Now, we use the two parts of this network to also with low-res wide-angle images that our robot uses to decide where to pay attention to, right? And we train a second component to predict the attention. And we compare that attention to the WAC photometric error or the low-res photometric error. And we use the attention to render the saccade camera, right? So we have a low-res We decide where to look, we render a saccad cam, generate the depth, and during training, there are 2 cameras. During testing, there's only 1, right? So this is what we did. We've trained it first on the Kitty dataset, and I'll show you real results with the hardware prototype in a second. So here's some images from the Kitty dataset. Here's the attention map, you can see here. Here's the target resolution that's equiangular. Here's the saccad cam images where we have a resolution in some areas. And here's the depth conventionally and the depth saccad cam. So I'm going to sort of zoom in onto this block some more. So here's the depth when you do equiangular. Here's the depth when you do saccad cam with the same resolution bandwidth. And you can see that we detect very interesting objects, wires, thin poles, distant cars, many objects of interest that are lost in the equiangular, right? And so here's a video of this working. So I'm going to play this video. Again, this is all in simulations, the Kitty data set. Here's saccad cam data, right? So some of it is in high res, some of it is in low res. Here's the attention map, and here's the predicted depth. You can see as it takes a right, pay attention to this traffic pole. It's in high attention, it's reconstructed well, and it's in high resolution. This video plays on for 5 minutes. It's available on our website. And you can, if you play through the whole thing, you'll see pedestrians and other interesting things that have high attention. Even though this method was trained only on 1 image, it has a kind of continuity, as you can see. Here's a table of our results. I just want to point out here before we look at, I'm just going to flash it at you here briefly, but I just want to point out one important thing, which is saccad cam only works in a special range, right? If you have so much resolution that breaking it into areas of interest and not doesn't make any difference, right? You're much higher than the Nyquist limit for all the targets, then it doesn't make a difference. If your resolution, your bandwidth is so low, then it doesn't matter if you're distributing it, you get errors everywhere, right? So that also doesn't work. So there's this sweet spot where you have enough resolution where putting some on target makes it better there, but losing it on the background doesn't make a difference, right? So there's kind of a place for saccad cam to excel. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the hardware that we built. We literally built a saccad cam. So here's our wide angle low res camera up here. Here's the MEMS mirror. Here's a camera that zoomed in onto the MEMS mirror, right? So you get like high res in some region. Here are actual pictures from the MEMS mirror, and I've shown this ellipse because our MEMS mirror is a circle. So depending on foreshortening, you can see ellipses are different parts of it. Here's a low res image of the scene. Here's some high res regions in here, and here's the reconstruction of those of the whole scene with the high resolution regions as well. Now here's the another view of the prototype. Here's the data from it happening in real time outside. So this is outside the electrical and computer engineering department at UF. I'm going to play this video. You can see this low res scene, and you can see 15 squares, right? And these are high res regions, and it's not happening in software, right? It's happening in hardware in real time. We're capturing these patches, and where to capture the patches is given by an algorithm that was trained on Kitty, right? And that has some idea of where the best places to put resolution to optimize depth, right? It has learned that from end to end, where to put the patches, right? And so here's a reconstruction again. Here's saccad cam images. Here's the attention map. This is the output of our network. But here's where we put the 15 patches to best match the attention map. Here's the target depth and the saccad cam depth. Target depth is what we would do equiangular, right? Now, first I'm going to look at this component over here. Now, you know that our attention map changes the attention per pixel, right? That's why it has this kind of deformable look to it. But we only have 15 squares. Right? So how do we decide where to put the squares? Well, there's an additional step to create physically realizable fovea, right? And the way we do that is we have 2 algorithms, one which we did in the paper, and you see the results here, which is a greedy algorithm. You just select the max value and put a fovea there. You destroy the data in that fovea, and then you calculate the next max in your attention. You avoid overlap with this algorithm. It's greedy, there's no proof here. But we also have a general knapsack-based algorithm that works even when you have a liquid lens and you can change the size of your box. How would you pack them together to have maximum attention gain, right? And so you can look at that in the paper. We haven't implemented that. We just proposed it in the supplement. Right? So, and now I'm going to show you the depths. Here's the depth when you do equiangular sampling. And here's the depth when you do Saccade cam sampling, when you intelligently distribute the depth. And you can again see we get fine features like distant trees, traffic poles, electric poles, things like this are reconstructed well in Saccade cam. Right? All right, so far I've talked to you about a foveated LiDAR. I've talked to you about a foveated camera, and I can take questions on any of these before I go to the last part of my talk. Does anybody have any questions? You can speak up, or you can type in, or you can just wait till the end of the talk if you're shy.
I had one clarification question. When you're evaluating performance on the depth, what is your ground truth to compare against?
Yeah, so Kitty has, so that's an excellent question. So our ground truth is the maximum resolution possible with Kitty, right? So there's some max resolution, we call that the ground truth resolution, you get depth. And then we look at, let's say, some percentage of that, 70%, let's say. That's our bandwidth. And we compare between equiangular and distributed to that. Okay. We also have a really interesting table in our paper where we compare to the LiDAR ground truth that exists in Kitty to show that there exists a there. That if you can optimally, let's say an oracle tells you the right place to distribute resolution, how well you can do. It's a very interesting table. It's not a result table. It's just like a data science table that says what is possible. And what is possible is quite amazing. If you have beautiful, perfect distribution of resolution, you can actually come very close to ground truth resolution, even at 70% or 50%. But that's if you have perfect, if your algorithm is perfect. So our algorithm is not perfect. So, but it does better than equian. Does that make sense?
All right. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, Sanjeev, I guess I was wondering, so the idea is just you have, this ends up being two cameras and you're using one of them to kind of fill out areas of interest, and you're kind of effectively getting a much higher resolution image than you would be able to with one big high resolution camera.
So yeah, so the idea is that you can talk about within your field. So let's say we fix our field of view, you can talk about angular resolution within your field of view, like how many samples, right? And let's say you have a bandwidth for whatever reason, storage, communication, whatever processing, you have some bandwidth. And so what is done now is equiangular sampling. That's the default. Yeah. But I'm going to take some of my resolution, put it on my wide angle camera, right? So I always get this wide angle low res, and the rest of the resolution I'm going to dedicate to the mirror and move it around, depending on what my algorithm says is the best place to do for depth reconstruction, which is the only task we've targeted so far.
Oh, I see. And because you have higher resolution in some areas, you get better depth resolution.
Yes, in those areas, and you have to decide where's the best places to put that, and that depends on understanding the low res and saying, okay, these places I can give up, these places I need more. And in simulation, you have perfect foveation. Each pixel can decide whether or not it should be foveated or whether it should be higher, it should be divided into 4 or into 8. And then, but in the actual camera, you have these squares, and you have to fit the squares to the deformable foveation, which is what it is.
And that early video where you showed the guy holding two different things, was the camera zooming back and forth between them? Is that what I should have seen there?
So the mirror was moving.
Oh, sorry, the mirror. Yeah.
The mirror was moving between them, and so they started on the table. So in that one, there was no low-res camera. There was just the one foveated camera. So they started on the table, and then it gets a sense. It uses basically a kind of Kalman filter that we adapted for Fovea cam, and keeps track of where things are and tries to modify what we call the Lissajau pattern between the two to get those two.
Okay, Lissajau curve pattern. Okay, thank you.
We have one more question by Tim in the chat. He says, for the driving video, what was the algorithm used to determine points of interest?
For the video from Kitty, it was the same algorithm I just discussed, the one that takes the low res and comes up with areas of interest to increase the resolution for depth reconstruction. So it was a full simulation of Saccade cam in the Kitty dataset. So there was a low res, predicted the attention, you put high res there, You blended the two to get saccade cam, and then you estimated the depth, right? During training, that was done with 2 cameras using the photometric loss that I mentioned. But during testing, which is what I showed you, there was just the 1 camera that's moving through the kiddie scene. Thank you. I'm going to jump to the last part of my talk. This is the block diagram I showed you of the LiDAR with the laser reflecting off the MEMS mirror. And so what I do for this last part of the research I'm going to talk about, I replace the LiDAR with bright light source. So it's just DC, it's unmodulated, bright light source, and the mirror moves really quickly. And we have a high-speed camera looking at this. And what this becomes is a fast projector, right? So if I had the luxury of talking to you all in person, we'd probably project my talk on a screen. There'd be a projector doing that. This is that kind of projector, except it's very fast. And in the sensor, there's also a high-speed camera looking at this. So with this device, you can emulate what someone like Paul Debevec has done on large stages for light transport on sort of a desktop environment. So here are 2 videos of a glass being turned and a V-groove being folded. And so you might wonder, why am I showing you these kind of low quality videos? So I'm showing you these low quality videos because they're special. They're captured with our sensor. And every frame of this video is actually made up of a very fast dot moving over the scene. So the video I showed you is actually a video of videos. Each frame is made up of this dot moving over the whole scene really quickly, fast enough that it finishes the scan before the scene has moved much. And this scanning captures something that's called light transport, right? And with the light transport, you can do some amazing things. So first, I'm going to show you sort of a fun thing that you can do with light transport. And then I'm going to show you an application that might have impact in robotics. So here's a fun thing you can do with light transport. You can take the scene I showed you with the glass or something else, and you can relight it after capture. This isn't completely in software, after you capture, as if it was illuminated by some illumination you found on the internet. So here again is this glass, and now we're pouring some water into it. And here is a relighting of the same scene after we capture. So I'll do it again. Right. So again, so here is the scene being, here's the glass being put down with water. And here's how that scene would have looked like if the illumination had been this. Here's another example. Here's a water pouring down somebody's hand. And again, you can relight it as if it had been relayed with this illumination. And so we can play such light tricks because we have the light transfer. But an application that you might be interested in is looking around an obstacle, looking around a corner. How often this would be very useful for a robot system. So what we can do with this system is we can do something called dual videography. In software, after capture, we can change the location of the camera and the light source virtually, right? We can render an image as if it was from the light source point of view illuminated by the camera, right? This can happen in software, and this happens if you can capture the light transfer. And amazingly, this works even when there are some obstacles, which I've shown here in red, that prevent the high-speed camera from seeing the scene, but the light source can still see the scene, right? The light source can still illuminate the scene. Using diffuse reflections across the wall or what have you, you can render a scene as if it's viewed directly. Right? So now I'm going to show you some examples of this. Here you can see my student is pouring liquid into a cup, and here's the camera is occluded from that cup by this 2 of hearts card, right? But the light source is illuminating everything, right? So here's the camera view. You can see the 2 of hearts. You can't see the glass, and the water is pouring behind the glass. But you can see some effects on the wall. So what you can do is you can replace the viewpoint with the projector, and now you can totally see the glass. You can see the water pouring into the glass and the level of the glass, right? You can also see the 2 of hearts, right? So you can switch the camera and light source. Here's another example. Here's a card that's being rotated. Here's the camera view. You can see what it is, the 10 of hearts, but now you can't really see it. Right? I'll play that again. So you can see the 10 of hearts, and then it goes away. But the projector is always illuminating the card. That's why you can see its shadow here all the time. So from the projected viewpoint, you can always see the 10 of hearts. Even when it's turned away from the camera, you can see it by reconstructing these diffuse to diffuse reflections. Here's another example where the camera is viewing the scene through thick glass. This thick glass causes a lot of distortion. And you can see the distortion in the playing cards that are being dropped. You can't see any of these, right? But you can just see kind of defocused kind of things. But by inverting the light transport matrix, you can directly see very clearly what the cards are, even very complicated things like the King of Hearts, right? You can sort of invert this. So here's another example of the camera looking at the scene through pouring water, right? Where the light source is illuminating directly. Right? Again, this is created by this MEMS mirror scanning. And you can see the camera gets occluded by the water droplets, but the projector can still see the view. And also you get the effect as if it's illuminated from within the waterfall, creating caustic effects like you see at the bottom of a swimming pool on a sunny day. Right? Now, capturing this kind of data for looking around corners is really cool, but it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of data to scan this dot. Most of the images are black, so you're wasting a lot of storage and communication. So what we did is we investigated how to capture these in a reduced number of measurements. Now, MEMS mirrors under resonance scan a pattern called a Lissajau pattern. It's 5-dimensional. Here's the equation for the Lissajau pattern at the bottom, right? And so what you can do is, we showed in the paper a proof which says that given a attention map, some neural network says these are the places to pay attention. You can generate a Lissajau overlap pattern that is optimal. There exists a best Lissajau overlap. Now, we didn't prove how to find it, but we did prove that there exists a best one. And we derived it from the mechanical equations of the MEMS mirror, right? The mechanical transfer equations. Now, when you do this kind of fast sampling to reduce the amount of data you have holes in your capture. And we used video interpolation to fill it out. Now, it turns out if you use the state-of-the-art video interpolation, at that time it was ZSM, a few years ago, it's a neural network. You can do fine-tuning on this light transport data and do much better. So here's the ground truth. Here's subsampling and interpolating with that. Even if you use optical flow or even if you use ZZM without any fine-tuning, our stuff does much better, reconstruct very fine features in the light transport. So here's a real example of subsample. This takes much quicker and far less data, right? Now, I know you can see this kind of curve, but we all understand that each frame is made up of a dot moving along that curve very quickly. And so what we do is we interpolate this in the light transport domain. So we take these dots, let's say it's 1/8 sampling, and we interpolate the dots sort of in a binary search manner. This is not interpolating in the image space, we interpolate in the light transport space using this high resolution video reconstruction network. And we're able to fill all the holes. You can see it fills the holes. You remember, it's not happening in the imaging domain, happening in the light transport domain. And we're able to do things like reconstruct, fill all the holes in this kind of reconstruction. We're able to capture this kind of data much quicker than any of the results I showed you before. Now, before I talk about future work, I just want to summarize what I've talked to you about today. I've talked to you about adaptive attention inside the camera. I've talked to you how a LiDAR can use it to improve depth reconstruction in certain areas. I've talked to you about how a projector can use it to look around corners. And I've talked to you about how a foveated camera can distribute intelligently resolution in the image plane to optimize some vision task. In this case, it was depth reconstruction. Now, for future work, everything I've shown you so far uses this MEMS mirror. But there are other kinds of interesting optics that I'm trying to build in my cameras. These include liquid lenses that can change the size of the dot or the size of the fovea. If they're combined with spatial light modulators, then you can have coded apertures whose size and pattern changes in real time. You can also build reflective and waveguide-based phase arrays. Now, these obviously don't work for incoherent light, but for coherent light, for LiDARs, we're talking about gigahertz kind of modulation. Imagine a smart LiDAR which has 1 billion depth points a second that you can intelligently place. How awesome that would be for optimizing some computer vision task instead of just capturing equiangle. So that's what we can push in the optics. But more than that, I'm very interested in this idea of generalized attention, right? So if you look at our eye has a fovea, a small region of acuity that we move around. So if you look at this scene, this mountain scene. If you were there, this is what you would see. You'd see a low res, but there would be a region of high res that your eye is moving around, and your brain would integrate all together to see a complete photograph. But there's many other kinds of foveation in the animal kingdom. Here's a mantis shrimp. It's an underwater creature. It's amazing. It has a thin row of color receptors in its eye. And so it sees the world in black and white, and it foveates color, right, up and down in the scene, right? And so I imagine, in the future, cameras that can, in real time, adaptively change every part of the light field that they capture. Resolution, time, color, spectrum, polarization, all together to optimize some computer vision task, right? And that's really what I'm pushing for in my lab. With that, I'd like to thank my students. 4 of them have already graduated. 3 of them are hard at work, and we've hired 2 more. We're expanding. I'd like to thank the funding agencies, the ONR, the NSF, the DHS, the MIST Center, and many others, including my NSF career a few years ago. I'd like to thank all my collaborators across different universities. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention on this beautiful Earth Day in your wonderful campus in lovely Seattle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Great talk. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Nick.
I have one. So I'm curious if across these projects you found situations, I guess, where you can trick these cameras, or what kinds of situations present a challenge to learning-based approaches here?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So, I really like the biological analogy. And there's obviously things that confuse us, right? Optical illusions, right? So where resolution doesn't make a difference. There are so many optical illusions that would be really clear if, like a snake, you viewed the world in thermal, right? Or if you had depth reconstruction that was active, like sonar, like echolocation, rather than passive viewing stereo. So I think there's an issue of confusing a particular domain, but I do think that if you had a heterogeneous array of cameras and you had time to optimize samples between them, the disagreements between cameras tell you the interesting parts of the scene that are proving difficult to any one particular domain. And that's what I like to call the anomaly detection application that I think that's a very rich direction to go in. So definitely, if you stick to one kind of system, you will fail, and those are the optical illusions of that system. But I do think that there's advantage for heterogeneous. Hopefully that answered your question.
Awesome talk, Sanjeev. This is super fascinating. I wanted to, this may be kind of a dumb thing, but I'm curious about tiny cameras. And I wanted to, you said you had this thing about a trick where you put something inside the camera somehow. It was back in your LiDAR section.
So the trick is actually let me see if I explain the trick for your LiDAR that you have, right? Like, so you showed me a LiDAR today, which is one measurement, right? Like, so there's one measurement.
Yeah.
And so the way that works is that the receiver, the sensor of the receiver is at the focal length of the lens receiving. So, you shine a light, it's in focus, and you grab it at the receiver. What happens though, and this happens for my system, it won't happen for yours, but in case you change the angle of the transmitter, you get nothing, because even though it's in focus, that image moves. You don't have an image plane, you have just one pixel in the center. So if you move around the image plane, there's no measurement. And so what we did is we moved that lens closer, so the dot that you measure is in defocus. It's larger than it should be. It's defocus.
Yeah.
Even if the dot moves away from the optical center, some part of it is still overlapping on that central pixel, which is the only pixel you have and I have in these kind of small systems. And so you can sort of detect that response. So you get a bigger field of view by defocusing counterintuitive. So,
oh, I see. Interesting. Yeah. You probably lose some, I guess you know the direction because you're steering the mirror, right?
You lose SNR because you're defocusing, so you don't have
as much bright, you don't get as much light coming in. Yeah.
So you have a dimmer, bigger dot.
Yeah.
You get more.
I understand. Okay, that's a cool trick. Okay.
Apparently, we were told by a reviewer we were not the first. Somebody in the 60s thought about it, so now we cite them. But I think
maybe one more question by Aaron.
Thanks, Sanjeev. That was a really great talk. In the foveated camera for monocular depth estimation, I'm really interested in the interface where you come to this point where you have two images that are at different resolutions, and that you now need to feed them into a computer vision algorithm that's been designed for a single camera. How did you handle that kind of mixed resolution to?
So I should be very clear about what's happening there. So the field of view so the number of pixels is always the same, right? So you can have a 10 by 10 image at high res, and you can have a 10 by 10 image that's heavily deblurred. It's still 100 pixels, but the angular resolution has been lowered, right? So the size of the images is always the same in our processing, but the data that's in there is different. So we avoided the problem of actually shrinking the wide angle and sort of increasing.
Okay, I see. So you inserted the depth map from the focused image into the wide area depth map.
Yeah, so we did it for the color image because the depth map is the output of our algorithm, but we created SACAD-CAM, which is a color image, which is the same number of pixels as regular, but some part
I see. Okay.
And some part of sharp, but the size is the same.
I see. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's thank Sanjeev again, and see you later.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.